Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Heritage Talks Online. My name is Heather Darch, and I'm here with Glenn Patterson, and we are project directors for the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, also known as QAN. Thank you for joining our series today. It's actually our last presentation in this series called Dreaming Big, Inspiring Stories from Across Quebec's Heritage Community. This series, we've been exploring the inspiring stories from Quebec historical societies, archives, museums, community organizations, and cultural groups whose vision has had a lasting impact on the history and heritage of Quebec. QAN is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to protect and preserve the history, heritage, and culture of Quebec's peoples right across the province. You're welcome to become a member of QAN, and membership is open to everyone, including community groups and heritage organizations. So if you'd like to know a little bit more about us, please check out our website at qahn.org for more information. Membership gives you access to all kinds of interesting workshops and programs, up and coming research and publications going on across the network, and to our own Quebec Heritage News publication. It's a great magazine filled with interesting articles, history, pictures, information about projects that the community groups are doing. And so if you'd like to become a member and join this great network, you'll get Quebec Heritage News in your mail 4 times a year. First-time new members can take advantage of a special 30% discount that we're offering during the length of time of our broadcast. That's just $20 for a 1-year membership. So if you're interested, please send us a note in the Facebook Live, or if you're on Zoom today, please send us a note in chat at the bottom of your screen and let us know that you'd like to become a member of our really dynamic network. I would like to thank our funders who have helped make this series possible, including Canadian Heritage, the Chalkers Foundation, the Zeller Family Foundation, and the Townshippers Foundation. All of our presentations are recorded, including today. And if you'd like to go back and see any of our presentations, you just have to go to our Quebec Heritage Talks Facebook page, and there you'll find all of the presentations in our series and the series from last year as well. Now I'm going to turn it over to Glenn for a few moments, and he's just going to give you a bit of tech talk about how you can manage the program today. Hi, Glenn.
Hi, Heather. Welcome everyone on Zoom and Facebook Live and YouTube. We also have a YouTube channel. So yeah, I'm here helping with the tech. If you're on Zoom, if you have any problems, you can use the chat box in Zoom. If you're using a PC or a laptop, you can find that at the bottom of the screen. If you're on a mobile device, you may have to tap on your Zoom app to make the chat box come up. For Facebook, there's not much I can do to help there, but if you're having problems, let us know in the comments because I'm curious if there are ever any issues. Maybe I can look into them later. But as Heather mentioned, we're recording this Heritage Talk today, like all our Heritage Talks, and we are live streaming to Facebook and YouTube. So if you're on Zoom and you're uncomfortable being part of the recording, you're welcome to leave the Zoom call and hop on over to the QAN Heritage Talks Facebook page. It's a public page. You don't need a Facebook account, and you'll be able to see the video there if that suits you better. So that's all I have for now. Back to you, Heather.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Our guest speaker today is Justin Burr of Mile End Memories. Justin has been a member of the board of Mile End Memories since 2008, a co-author of the Dictionnaire historique Plateau Montréal, published in 2017. He is particularly interested in the development of Montreal neighbourhoods during the electric streetcar era. He is a doctoral student in urban studies at UQAM and a Montreal tour guide. His talk today is called Mile End Memories, Preserving Montreal's Historic, Diverse, and Creative Community. Hi, Justin, and welcome to Heritage Talks Online.
Hello, thank you, Heather. And actually, just to complicate life, I decided to slightly alter the topic of the sorry, not the topic, the title of the presentation, although not too much. Of course, let me just get this the usual drama, getting your screen shared. There it is. Okay. Okay, so now hopefully everything's doing okay with the screen sharing. I'm going to, okay. My minor title changes. I decided it should be more like celebrating a historic, diverse, and creative Montreal community. My land is best known, I suppose, for bagels, and it's also probably best known for being a fun neighborhood with great music, at least in the 1990s and early 2000s. It's a neighborhood that's always been a hotbed of change and transformation. So whatever you think of it, now it's not going to be like that in 20 years' time. And many people with great memories of what it was like 20 years ago are a little disappointed that it's not quite like that anymore today. But that's the way it is. It's a place where things are always being tried out, when new things are always happening. And Myland Memories has been around now for, well, we're coming up to our 20th anniversary in the beginning of next year. So it's been a while. Although Myland Memories actually sort of had its start, or no, I shouldn't say that. Myland heritage and history groups had their start another 10 years earlier, with the 1993 opening of the new public library, which had just moved into a former Anglican church, that had had to close its church because there wasn't much of a community left in the neighborhood, and they couldn't maintain the building anymore. And local activists had managed to persuade the city that it would be a great place to turn into the new public library. And the same people also founded Société Myland pour l'Histoire et la Culture, and put on a really interesting exhibition about the history of the neighborhood. Nobody had really delved into it before. Montreal's 350th anniversary had just been celebrated, and so that was a good impetus for a lot of heritage groups to get started in the Montreal area. And remember, back then, we didn't have digital humanities. We didn't have everything online available. You had to actually write letters or go and visit archive centers. You had to go through newspapers on microfilm. I have lots of admiration for our predecessors, who back in 1993 managed to do such a really interesting exhibition with the means that they had at the time. But Myland Memories really got started in 2002, when a new member, Susan Bronson, along with some of her friends and colleagues, wanted to work on religious heritage in Myland. And they put together a walking tour and a brochure that you see here, in both languages, English and French. It was printed in 5,000 copies, which disappeared pretty quickly. Myland's religious heritage is interesting because each community all through the 20th century had their places of worship. And as a very diverse neighborhood, the buildings that were used for religious practice ended up being handed on from one community to the next all through the century. And so there's a lot of repurposed buildings and a lot of variety in the different practices, the different communities that are represented in the neighborhood. So that was a very interesting start. Unfortunately, they and the people who were already there from the exhibition a few years earlier ended up having differences of opinion about how the organization should be run. And so that's what actually started Myland Memories in 2003. They broke off, formed a new organization. The old Historical Society ended up winding up after a while. Although some of its members went on to join the Société d'Histoire du Plateau Mont-Royal, which is still around, very vigorous. And so now we have, in the Plateau Mont-Royal, larger area that includes Myland, we have a historical society, and we have our local group in Myland as well. Very interesting to have overlapping historical societies, because you get different points of view, different areas of interest, and lots of opportunities for collaboration, and we avoid treading on each other's toes, and we get along very well, actually. So in 2003, Myland Memories was registered, what the Quebec government calls an association, so it's a very light structure. Its purpose, number one, was to travailler à la sensibilisation et à la promotion du patrimoine de l'histoire et de la culture du district de Myland. And the organization from the very beginning offered walking tours from April, well, more like May to October, and then talks, lectures, roundtables, readings the rest of the year, often at the library. The activities have always been in French or in English or bilingual. This neighborhood is very much in the picture, the portrait of Montreal as a bilingual community. You find that very much in Myland, and lots of work in partnership with other community groups. There you see us after I arrived in 2008. That was the board in 2010, where we did a rather fun photo session in front of the Myland's old town hall. And then as time went on, the organization got a little bit more structured. In 2008, we got our fabulous logo, the houses on their walking tour, which was designed by Marilyn Nadeau, a Quebec City-based graphic designer. In 2009, we started our website with, amazingly, the assistance of some tourism researchers in Auckland, New Zealand. But that's because one of the board members had connections with the people in New Zealand. And then we took that local very shortly afterwards. And in 2011, we finally incorporated the group as a proper nonprofit organization, personne morale, with letters patent and all the rest of it. So now we can apply for grants, which back in 2011, it was sort of like, well, it would be nice to have this possibility sometime in the future. And then just a few years later, the opportunities arose and we were able to do funded projects. And it's been very, very helpful to have an organization that's properly incorporated. So there's a screenshot of our first website way back in 2009, 2010. It was very plain. Is that? Yes, I'm sorry. As time went on, we got new board members. We had new interests, new areas of research. And although the organization had not done much in the way of written documentation, that changed with the arrival of Yves Desjardins on the board around 2011, 2012. He was trained as a historian, but wanted and was just retiring from his career as a journalist at Radio-Canada. As a retirement project, he wanted to write up the history of the neighborhood. He thought it would be just a matter of compiling stuff that had already been written and just to put it together into a nice form. A quick project. And wouldn't it be nice if, once he met us and became a member of Myland Memories, wouldn't it be nice to put that on the website? And I, as the webmaster, thought it was great that we could actually have some real content. Well, once we put together Yves' compilations and our compilations and other information, we ended up realizing this was a real research project with a lot of very interesting material. And Yves started publishing on our website and then caught the eye of Septentrion, the publishers in Quebec City, who offered him to publish it as a real book. And then more or less around the same time, I had launched the Dictionnaire historique du Plateau Mont-Royal project, where along with Bernard Vallée, who has for decades been doing very interesting walking tours and collecting information on all sorts of social movements and architectural history and social history in Montreal, not just the Plateau, but other parts as well. We had a lot of material we wanted to put out there. And so simultaneously, actually, the two books were prepared. We also had Josh Wolf, another Myland Memories board member with the Dictionnaire historique. And we talked with Jean-Claude Robert to be our scientific advisor for the dictionary. And he thought the project was so much fun, he ended up becoming a writer along with the rest of us. So those two books came out in 2017. Obviously, everyone was trying to put Montreal history books out in 2017 because it was the year of the 375th anniversary, and we wanted to take advantage of that focus on Montreal history. In any case, it was really important, though, that we had the historical group, Myland Memories, because that gave us a place to meet each other, to collaborate, and to share information that ended up being very valuable. Also for the 375th, the people who are working on the books aren't the only board members of Myland Memories. We had the great opportunity of having fabulous board members with all sorts of wonderful ideas. I should mention, I suppose, at this point, that the board members have generally been people with an interest in history, architecture, urban planning, although we also had an English teacher, a literature teacher, French literature teacher. We've had people with all sorts of different academic backgrounds involved in, many of them involved in research themselves, as well as being residents of the neighborhood and very interested in its in its characteristics and wanting to know more about it. And so we have a richness of backgrounds and interests. And one of our board members was a recently graduated urban planning student, Alice Niquet, who was instrumental in getting the Viaduc 375 project going. But then also we had met a visual artist, Laurence Cambois Bernard, who had done a master's at UQAM involving multimedia projection on buildings, and had done an activity like that in Milan that we had helped out with a bit. And then there was the Le Champ des Possibles, a local community project to use leftover land from a former railway yard that was being recycled into a natural park that was not manicured, but just allowed to express its biodiversity and to evolve naturally. And its managing director, Caroline Magar, was with us as well on that project as well. So with people from different areas, including the also from the other side of the boundary with the Rosemont-la-Patrie borough of Montreal, the Sodère, they all put together this fabulous project where we would take the highway overpass that passes alongside the neighborhood and turn it into a place for activities for a week. So we got the city to allow the overpass to be closed, or well, they only let us have half of it, but still that was good. We had half the overpass on which people could have social activities, cultural activities. We had concerts, historical activities. We had put up plaques. We did walking tours. And the whole thing was also sort of tactical urban planning. In other words, how does it work out to close off this highway access? Will the traffic adjust to it? Do people have, well, now that people can actually stand quietly on this overpass and look at the landscape, will they come up with ideas? And so a lot of interesting things were done that year. And also for the 375th anniversary of Montreal, we put together a series of 25 walking tours in collaboration with the Société d'Histoire du Plateau Mont-Royal. We split them up half and half. Also got other friends and associates to provide some of the tours. And so we were able to put on a even richer than usual program of tours that year. Although many of these tours have been repeated since then. So it was sort of a launching pad for some new ideas. Also, Myland Memories in 2018 came up with its 15th anniversary. We had a celebration at the Rialto Theatre, and we had invited local artists Pascal Girard and Michel Hellman. They sketched the anniversary party, and the following year we put together a little booklet called Myland Portraits, or Portrait du Myland, with an outline history of the neighborhood and lots of illustrations. And this book was we published it ourselves. We published it. Myland Memories was the publisher, using an instant book printing service. And we had the help of the Drawn and Quarterly bookstore in the neighborhood who sold it for us, and it was actually very successful. And then as for our website, the biggest thing on it right now, I suppose, that ongoing is an interactive map, which is just a way of having keys towards the research articles that we have on a whole bunch of different buildings around the neighborhood. It's hard to have an index into different articles unless it's something arbitrary like alphabetical order. But if you put everything on the map, and then you can see how things relate to each other, and you can click on them and see and go directly to the information, that makes it much more accessible. Most of the information, though, on our interactive map is French only. Some of the articles have been translated. We like to do everything in both languages when we can, but it turns out that there's generally most of the Anglophones in the area are bilingual, and there are certainly more people functioning in French than in English overall. And so our programming has gradually sort of drifted towards being a little bit more priority on the French side. But certainly we still continue to do stuff in English when we can. And there's quite a lot of English material on the website, including on the interactive map. Some of the articles there, we also had the collaboration of the Laboratoire d'Histoire et de Patrimoine de Montréal at UQAM, where research assistants, grad students have helped us out. And so some of it's come from our own board members and so on. So we have a lot of material that we're gradually collecting over the years, a lot more coming in the pipeline as well. And we continue to do walking tours and talks at the library. Although, admittedly, the past 2 years, of course, our activities were severely limited. And unlike some historical societies, we did not do a Zoom series, a virtual series of lectures. Okay, let's go on though. I wanted to talk about not just about the organization Myland Memories, but also about the area itself. And after that, I will go on to talk about our project that we did with Kwan in the Belonging and Identity project, Belonging and Identity program at the end. And so here I've been talking about Myland without actually saying exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about an area just on the north side of downtown Montreal, and on the east side of the mountain, Mount Royal. Essentially, the backbone of the area is Saint Laurent Boulevard, which started out as a country road, which the Sulpician priests responsible for Notre Dame Basilica in Old Montreal, and also the Seigneur of the island of Montreal. In 1717, they decided it was time to lay out a straight road going from the center of the city, that is Old Montreal, today's Old Montreal, right up to the Côte Saint Laurent area, which is whose backbone road, whose central road is now the metropolitan autoroute. So imagine from Old Montreal up to the metropolitan in a straight line, that's Saint Laurent Boulevard, or at the time, the Saint Laurent Road. And there had been a few years earlier a tannery in the area. In today's terms, it was on the corner of Mount Royal Avenue and Henri Julien Avenue, for those of you who know the area. In any case, not too far off the Saint Laurent Road. And once the Saint Laurent Road was there, a crossroad was built to link it to the Saint Laurent Road. That crossroad became the first section of what is now Mount Royal Avenue. And then on the other side, in 1800, the road to Côte Sainte Catherine, otherwise known as Outremont, but Outremont was a much later name. So the old rural road that went up to the Côte Sainte Catherine area on the northeast flank of the mountain was straightened out so that it came out in a straight line along with the road to the tannery. So another section of today's Mount Royal Avenue. And that intersection, Saint Laurent and Mont Royal in today's terms, was therefore, as of 1800, as of the straightening out, it became a four-way country road intersection. All around, it's all empty fields, but here we have a nice rural crossroads. And in 1804, John Clark, inspector of beef and pork, recently arrived from Durham, England, purchases the land on the west side of Saint Laurent Road, including the west side of that crossroads. And then we see a few years later, in April 1808, the earliest appearance of Myland in print in the Montreal context. There's his advertisement. He's providing good pasturage for horses and cows at the head of St. Lawrence suburb, the St. Lawrence suburb being the area immediately north of Old Montreal along the St. Lawrence Road. So if you go a little bit farther up the road, then you end up in John Clark's area. And you see he's talking about his how much he charges per month for taking care of your horses or your cows. And he signs his advertisement, John Clark, Myland, April 21st, 1808. So there it is, the first known mention in print of the name. Now, Myland is not a unique name. It's John Clark was consciously taking it over from England because there are plenty of Mylands in England. The earliest one that is known goes back, in fact, to the 13th century, when on the road between London and Colchester in East Anglia, a little hamlet a mile outside the gates of the city of London was called Myland. And then it turns out there was also another Myland a mile before you got to Colchester. And then there ended up being Mylands all over the country, generally speaking, a mile outside some larger place. So John Clark must have thought, well, my Myland intersection it's a little over a mile from the city of Montreal. But if you think of Montreal as not just Old Montreal, but also the area, the St. Lawrence suburb that was developing and spreading away from the river towards Sherbrooke Street. By 1804, 1808, there was urbanization about as far as today's Ontario Street. And if you stood on the corner of Saint Laurent Road and Sherbrooke Street, which was just beginning to exist back then, and you looked towards the river, down the hill towards the river, you'd see all of Montreal spread out before you at your feet. Little tiny town on the side of the riverbank. Well, little tiny town, nice medium-sized town on the waterfront there, spreading out gradually towards the north, but not too far. If you turned around and looked the other way, up the road towards Mile End, all you would see was the mountain dominating, the Mount Royal dominating the landscape, and fields all around you with the occasional nice stone house. And so you go for a mile along the road in the countryside and you get to Mile End. There it is. It turns out that in the previous century or so, the previous century and a half, a lot of people had tried to explain the origin of Mile End in all sorts of documents, official or not, newspaper articles, compilations of lists of municipal histories, whatever. And all the stories were a little bit different, and all the stories were a little bit off somehow. And so finally, it was largely due to the researchers for the 1993 Mile End exhibition that it was possible to trace things back as far as 1815 at first, and then 1810, with references to the John Clark property. But finally, I wrote an article about that a few years ago, and we got it straightened out. So there it is. Here's a map finally to show you. I should have shown this earlier, actually. The yellow blotch at the bottom then is today's Old Montreal. It's basically the part of the city that was surrounded by the fortification walls during the 18th century. You see the blue line going straight up. That's the Saint Laurent Road. The base map I've used here is a very beautiful topographic map from the 1860s, the fortification surveys maps. And so you can see lots and lots of streets on both sides of Saint Laurent Road by the 1860s. But you notice that the part that looks sort of urban tapers off pretty quickly about halfway toward Mile End, and then things become more and more countryside as you go beyond. And then you can see at Mile End, in the middle of just the top middle, that crossroads of which is today the intersection of Mount Royal Avenue. So let's go on. John Clark then rather quickly became associated with Stanley Bagg, and Stanley Bagg has been written about mainly by Janice Hamilton. Most notably, she wrote in Quebec, well, most notably for our purposes, she wrote in Quebec Heritage News the winter 2022 issue. So that's not the most recent issue, but the previous one. And she has an article called Stanley Bagg and the Mile End Tavern. So I won't go into that in too much detail, but just to say very briefly that Stanley Bagg leased John Clark's land. He sublet to an organization calling itself the Jockey Club of Montreal. And so we ended up with a race course, basically where Jeanne Mance Park is today, although quite a bit bigger. It expanded all the way up to the corner of Saint Laurent and Montréal. In 1819, Stanley Bagg married John Clark's daughter, Marianne, and they had one child, Stanley Clark Bagg, who inherited his father's and especially his grandfather's, John Clark's, real estate fortune. And then his wife and children had the opportunity of subdividing and selling that, giving them quite a lot of influence over the development of today's Mile End and other neighborhoods as well. They had land going all the way up as far as the Rivière des Prairies, and so there's parts of Ahuntsic as well that have Bagg influence and Bagg street names. In particular, street names that are very clearly associated with them in this area are Clark Street, of course, Bagg Street, Fairmount Avenue. Fairmount was the name of Stanley Clark Bagg's mansion. But there have been many other Bagg names around. Many of them have changed as well. But and then there's plenty more about the Baggs in various sources. Around the time that John Clark was offering pasture services. So in the early 19th century, his neighbors were starting to discover that the land around my land wasn't great for farming, but it was interesting because it had, well, it was rocky. It was excessively rocky, but the rocks weren't any rocks. They were actually very high quality gray limestone. And Montreal gray stone that's used for building so much of the 19th century city, well, it largely came from my land. My land, in a rather extended definition that goes, from the old Hôtel Dieu at Saint-Aubin Street all the way to Rosemont. But basically, there's a big, long vein of high quality stone, and starting near Saint Laurent Boulevard and gradually moving eastward, all through the 19th century, stone was taken out of these quarries to build the monuments of Montreal. We already knew from books about Notre Dame Church, including Franklin Toker's major study from 1970, that there are contracts for the building of the church that specify that the stone will come from Myland quarries. And I was able to locate precisely some of these quarries recently, basically between Saint Laurent and Saint Denis streets, just north of Mount Royal Avenue, holes in the ground, out of which came the stone for building Notre Dame Church. And plenty of other places around the area. Like every time every time you look around, you find where you were used to be a stone quarry. It's anyway, different maps show different areas under quarrying or former quarries turned into lakes or whatever, but there's a lot of places used as stone quarrying. And in 1846, as a municipal system was just barely getting off the ground in the province of Canada, Canada East, quarry owners incorporated the village of Côte Saint-Louis, covering essentially the area, the big chunk of territory on the north side of the then city of Montreal, covering all of today's Myland and an area going east as far as Papineau Avenue. So there's the quarry people, and then there's Pierre Beaubien. Pierre Beaubien was a medical doctor trained in Paris. He purchased the east side of Saint Laurent Road in 1842 and expanded that shortly afterwards. And then he very quickly, in 1849, actually donated various lots to the bishop, Ignace Bourget, the famous bishop who developed very much religious communities and Catholic parishes in 19th century Montreal, who stood up to the Sulpicians, who didn't want to create new parishes, and who had a huge influence on the Montreal Catholic social structure and institutional structure of Montreal. So he was happy to receive building lots from Pierre Beaubien for what became the Saint-Enfant Jésus Church in 1858. But right away in 1850, he had built the Institution Catholique des Sourds-Muets, so the Deaf and Dumb Institute, which later moved up to the corner of Saint-Laurent and de Castelnau. And the institution no longer exists, although deaf and dumb teaching has been moved into this institution. It's part of this Quebec Health and Social Services system, the Institut Raymond Dewar. The institution here, by the way, was for the boys who were deaf and mute, and there was a separate institution created later on for girls who had those same disabilities. In any case, this created a new civic center. It's what is now the intersection of Laurier and Saint Laurent. The church looked like that at the beginning, and it was later, in a gesture of municipal aggrandizement, was rebuilt with a much more grandiose new facade, which of course is still there today. And then Pierre Beaubien had a son, Louis Beaubien, who was well connected to people in the railway business, and was well connected to people in the Catholic hierarchy, including Curé Antoine Labelle of Saint-Jérôme, well known for his Petit Train du Nord. Well, Louis Beaubien worked with Curé Labelle to get that project to actually happen. He was a member of the Quebec Legislative Assembly and got a bill passed in 1869 that would provide provincial money for what they called colonization railways. And in 1869, to take advantage of that law, a company was formed called the Chemin. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It wasn't the Chemin de Fer de Colonisation, it was the Chemin à Lisse de Colonisation du Nord de Montréal. Meaning, because originally they thought they were going to build it with not with iron rails, but rather with wooden track with just a small piece of metal on top for the wheels to run on. That was something that was tried out from the 1830s to the 1860s as a way of trying to get railway construction done cheaper and faster. The problem was it wasn't durable. It couldn't really last through a Quebec winter. And so fortunately, they changed things before they actually built the Laurentian Railway. And when it was finally built from Mile-End to Saint-Jérôme, they built it with proper iron rails. In any case, this company was, of course, inspired by Antoine Labelle, but it was also supported and helped out by Hugh Allen, the very well-known shipping magnate and also a would-be railway promoter who tried to get involved in the Canadian Pacific project, but managed to bring down Sir John A. Macdonald's government by being a little bit indiscreet with his influence peddling. In any case, in the case of the Montreal Northern Colonization Railway, Hugh Allen did not cause political scandal. However, the company was not able to raise enough money. And in 1875, it was finally taken over by the Quebec government, and it became the Chemin de Fer de Québec, Montréal, Ottawa et Occidental. A name that was chosen because it works just as well in English as the Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, and Occidental Railway. Actually, at the time, railway names were often English. And so to avoid calling it the Montreal, Ottawa, and Western, which it had been known as just briefly for a few months beforehand, they renamed it Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, and Occidental, which gives us a wonderful name for a railway company. In any case, the government support was able to get the railway finished. It opened in October 1876. It did indeed pass through Mile-End. It didn't actually terminate at Mile-End the way that it had been initially planned. It ended up terminating on the edge of the St. Lawrence River at Hochelaga, passing through Mile-End in Beaubien land. And the Mile-End station, after Louis Beaubien had promised for forever and a day that surely there would be a Mile-End station near the village, near Mount Royal Avenue, near where all the people were. Well, finally, for operational reasons, it ended up being put up at what is now the corner of Saint-Laurent and Bernard. And what's important is that was in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing around, but it was on Beaubien land in the middle of the Beaubien fields. So they were able to take advantage of the future real estate development that was inevitably going to happen around the railway station, although it took quite a while. In 1878, though, just shortly after the railway opened, largely due to Beaubien dissatisfaction with the municipality of Côte-Saint-Louis, they managed to separate the Mile-End part, break it off and create a new town called Saint-Louis-du-Mile-End. And then Saint-Louis-du-Mile-End ended up developing very rapidly, starting in the 1890s once the electric streetcar arrived. So Mile-End was definitely a streetcar suburb. And the first major developers actually came from Toronto, with the wonderful names of Clarence J. McQuaig and Rienzi Athol Mannering. They had seen the Annex neighborhood in Toronto develop and become very successful. They hoped to reproduce that success here. They purchased first the property of the Perrault family around Park Avenue on the edge of Outremont, and then the neighboring Bag property, bringing them up to Saint Laurent Road. And they were definitely looking for a middle-class suburb, a nice middle-class suburb. In fact, maybe an upper middle-class suburb. In their advertisements, they tried to say that they were just as good and just as a nice area as a new village that was developing called Côte Saint-Antoine. And Côte Saint-Antoine renamed itself Westmount very shortly afterwards. So you see, these real estate developers had high ambitions for their neighborhood. They said it was going to be a strictly high-class suburb, and they insisted that there should be no tenements. Of course, tenements give you ideas of New York City apartment buildings that are with tiny places to live and no ventilation and no air, no light. But in the Montreal context, a tenement wasn't that bad. It was just our typical duplex or later on triplex. In any case, they wanted single family row houses like in Toronto. And then the streetcar didn't quite arrive when it was supposed to. And then an economic crisis hit. And so Milan got off, as a suburban development, got off to actually a bad start. By the end of the 1890s, however, unfortunately, McQuaig Mannering had to sell to and get other investors in the project, but they eventually were able to get something going. They also had to give up on the high-class ambitions. They built some nice houses on Park Avenue, most of which have been demolished since. But in the end, the neighborhood developed as a modest middle-class suburb with some even more modest housing as well, but a real mix. And mostly what the original developers would have called tenements, mostly typical Montreal duplexes and triplexes. Here's the poster that, not their first poster, this I think was their second poster. This is just an extract of it, of McQuaid and Mannering in early 1893 or late 1892, trying to show how wonderful their suburb was going to be. Notice that beautiful house that you see there in the lower left corner. That was a model home that Mr. Mannering had built for himself. He never actually lived there, but well, he tried to say, look, I'm living on my property and I have this beautiful house. Nobody actually really wanted to live there right away because the sewer system was also behind schedule. It was difficult getting new residential neighborhoods set up in the suburbs of Montreal in the 1890s. But once everything was in place, it took off really well. Now, it ended up being a multicultural industrial suburb rather than a strictly high-class Anglophone suburb. With the streetcar, everyone was looking for new housing. Office workers, yes, but also factory workers. Because we had the Beaubien's Railway running through the neighborhood, it was a good area for industry to start thinking about moving into. It was all greenfield sites. There was no industry at all until 1895, but in 1895, the first factory opened and then it just kept on going from there. And the Beaubiens and the town council really pushed for industrial development as well. Lots of tax breaks for companies that would be willing to set up a new factory in Milan. Not that was unique. The other suburban municipalities were doing it too, but Milan was one of the earliest to do it. And so with developers on one side pushing for middle to upper class people who are going to take the streetcar and go and work in the office towers downtown, and other developers trying to push for factories to be built beside the railway track with their workers living next door in nice but modest housing. And these two parts of the town are in the same town. It's not a very huge town. That means they're all side by side and in some ways mixed as well. And thus, Milan from this point forward will be a community reflecting the actual diversity of Montreal. It's a mixture of wealthy and modest, a mixture of Catholic and Protestant. Those were the big important distinctions of the day. Shortly afterwards, it became a very important Jewish neighborhood. And then later on, after World War II especially, other faiths arrived as well. It was a Francophone village to start with. Once the Toronto developers came in, there was a lot of Anglophones. And then as the 20th century went on, it became also very Allophone. In fact, in the 70s and 80s, it was considered to be the multi-ethnic neighborhood of Montreal. The city's first multilingual public library with books in 15 or so different languages was set up in Milan. And of course, that status didn't last all that long, but that's part of Milan's history. And just going back a little bit earlier, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it was the most important Jewish neighborhood of Montreal. And that's where Mordecai Richler was born. And he grew up in this neighborhood. He didn't actually call it Milan. The name Milan was out of fashion in the mid-20th century. And it only came back really in the 1980s. But nevertheless, his novels, The Apprenticeship of Diddy Kravitz, The Street, and so on, The Son of the Smaller Hero, they're all about this area and very vividly described. Now, I want to move on to one other thing without getting too much into Myland today, but if I'm very happy to talk about Myland today and more recent history, if there are questions afterwards. I want to talk about our Belonging and Identity Program project, which was to look for in search of Irish Myland. So Myland is, I've just mentioned that it was, Anglophone, Francophone, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and one of those communities that was in the mix from the 1890s until the 1920s and beyond was Montreal's Irish community. The Irish Myland is very visibly marked by this crazy church that you see in the middle of the picture here, with its beautiful, huge dome, and then that, very, very unusual round tower beside it. What's going on here? When people see that building, which is its actual name is St. Michael's and St. Anthony's Catholic Community, but when people see that building for the first time, they often think, "Goodness, that thing must be Eastern Orthodox." Or if they're being careless, they're not looking very closely, they don't notice the crosses on the tops of the domes. They say, "Oh, it looks like it's a synagogue, or maybe it's a mosque." Well, no, it's actually a Catholic church, and it goes back to 1915, and it is what is it? It's the time then when Myland, as one of the big new suburbs of Montreal, was attracting people from all over the city. And just as Jewish Montrealers came in large numbers to Myland, because it was a nice neighborhood and it was also very conveniently located right near Saint Laurent Boulevard, which had been their sort of axis from the late 19th century onward. Anyway, well, the Irish community also found it to be a very attractive neighborhood. There was also, though, there was even earlier, there was an Irish institution that came to Myland back when it was just barely getting its start together. And okay, I had this map here to show how I mentioned the Perrault land that became the western part of the Montreal Annex project of the Toronto developers. And here's the bag land that became the rest of Montreal Annex. And the red lines there are the railway. Here's the railway coming from Saint Jérôme and heading off towards Hochelaga, with some other parts that were added a little bit later. And then over here on the other side of Saint Laurent Boulevard is the Beaubien land. And Pierre Beaubien owned all of that, what's marked in that pinkish color. When he died, his son Louis inherited most of it, but Pierre Beaubien's wife, Justine Casgrain, Marie-Justine Casgrain, had a son from a first marriage from before she was a widow when she married Pierre Beaubien. And so the son of her out from her first marriage was also involved in the succession, and he ended up with a quarter of the land holdings. And so everything that's marked in a darker shade is what was eventually worked out between Louis Beaubien and his half-brother Hannibal Maguire, as how they would split up their inheritance. And so, but Hannibal Maguire lived in Louisiana. He had left Montreal long before, and he wasn't really interested in managing property in Montreal. He wanted to take his money and go back to Louisiana. So he sold to a Montreal real estate developer by the name of James Baxter. James Baxter, who was of Irish Ontario, James Baxter was born in Ontario, but his parents had come from Ireland. And I wonder then if it must have been James Baxter who got that other Irish institution to end up in Myland. Okay, I won't go through James Baxter's rather colorful banking career. He had some difficulties. He did build a very nice set of buildings on Saint Laurent Boulevard, which are still there today, though we call it the Baxter Block. Not in Myland, by the way. This is much closer towards the city center. But it was the Shamrock Lacrosse Club that he sold, that James Baxter sold a chunk of land to. And the Shamrock Lacrosse Club that was known for being, for having turbulent fans. This study went and compiled from newspaper reports of the 1860s and 70s the sorts of things that Shamrock fans did. They committed trespassing, vandalism, partisanship, verbal assault, alcohol abuse, gambling, play and player interference, field invasions, physical assault, and theft. It must have been fun to participate at a Shamrock Lacrosse Club match. Anyway, that was back then. The Shamrocks had managed to quiet things down a bit. They had moved their stadium to Westmount, but it was leased. And so here James Baxter was saying, well, why don't you buy cheap my land in Mile End? The streetcar will be there in no time, and you'll be able to get your fans to come out to your new stadium in Mile End. And there was, the streetcar finally showed up under the auspices of the Montreal Park and Island Railway Company, which was a company that only did the suburbs, but would have an exclusive deal for Mile End, and ran all the way to the Back River, all the way to the Rivière des Prairies. It's just that their service was late to open and it wasn't very reliable. Anyway, it was wonderful when it finally arrived, I suppose, but the Shamrocks nevertheless waited until the other streetcar company, the Montreal Street Railway, the reliable city streetcar company, also built a line to the Shamrock grounds. And then in the summer of 1895, some 4 or 5 years after they had bought the land, they finally opened their new stadium. And so there, the Irish lacrosse team had its home playing field, where today Jean Talon Market is located. And there was nothing around it. They had bought too much land purposely so they could have some extra to sell off as for building lots. They couldn't find anyone to purchase the building lots. Yes, this is showing this. The map that's on the background here is from 1914. So, 20 years later, you can see that things are starting to develop, but there's still a nice empty zone in front of the Shamrock Lacrosse grounds. It's like, it was not the best place to be growing, trying to sell lots back then. And the neighborhood Shamrock Park didn't go very far. In the early 1900s, it was trying to be sold off cheap. It was marketed as a place where workers who didn't have a whole lot of savings would be able to buy pieces of land for practically no down payment and easy monthly payments, that sort of thing. The big problem was that the sewer system hadn't quite reached that part of Mile End yet. Even Mr. Mannering's house was delayed because the sewer system was late. Well, back here where the Shamrock Club was, the sewer system wouldn't reach there for another 15 years. So that was one Irish concentration. It looks like it really only served to as a sports destination. Basically, it's a recreational destination. But there were nevertheless people of many Protestant and Catholic communities all over the area. The blue here is Mile End. The other colors are neighboring municipalities at the end of the 19th century, and the little points are all different churches, some of which are Catholic, some of which are Protestant, English and French speaking. And so in that big collection, you end up with St. Michael the Archangel Irish Church being founded, and then it kept on growing as people, all the communities were moving towards Mile End, including the Irish Catholics, and they needed a nice big church. And their second pastor, Luke Callahan, arranged for this majestic monument be built according to the plans of Aristide Bougon-Champagne, and there it is today. So an Irish church in a neighborhood where the Anglophone population diminished. Actually, I shouldn't say that. The populations of all sorts diminished a lot after the Second World War because old suburbs near the city center were no longer fashionable after the Second World War. Everyone wanted to move to the new suburbs. And so the Jewish community moved away. The Irish community moved away. The Anglo-Protestants had already moved away by the end of the First World War. It became a multi-ethnic neighborhood because there was lots of available inexpensive housing. And it's only in the 1980s that there was this, the yuppie time. The young urban professionals wanted to come back and live closer to the city, even if that meant buying a very rundown house that hadn't been properly renovated for the previous 60 years and putting some time and money into getting it fixed up, and then being able to enjoy the location close to the city center, close to the universities, and with good public transportation. And so that was that's what gives us the beginnings of Myland today. I need to end. Just one more thing, that once Myland became yuppified in the 80s, and to very good effect, in the sense that the new people who arrived set up a citizens committee, did a lot of work to get along with and integrate with the Greek, Italian, Portuguese communities that had been there for the previous decades, held wonderful street parties with lots and lots of food from all the different communities, made Saint Jean-Baptiste Day into a national celebration that everyone was very happy to participate in. And the neighborhood got this good reputation. And then the artists and the musicians, well, they were there, and they continued to become more and more numerous. And, after a while, there wasn't enough room left. It was too popular for the prices to stay low. The economy changed. Ubisoft arrived. Ubisoft expanded, and we ended up with a huge employment pool with lots of people working in high-paying jobs, wanting to live nearby. And as a result, the housing prices have recently gone through the roof. So things are always changing. And sometimes it's unfortunate change with good side effects, and sometimes it's what seems to be perfectly positive change, but that also has unfortunate side effects. And so we just have to keep on working all the time to mitigate the bad effects, encourage the good effects, and work for what we hope our neighborhood is going to be, and remember the past, as that helps understand where things came from and where we can head for in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin. That fabulous unpacking of this wonderful history in your neighborhood. And you can tell how much you actually love your neighborhood just by the way you speak about it. I'm just going to introduce Glenn back in so that people can ask questions. I'm sure there'll be some.
Of course there are, Heather. There are always good questions here. So if you're with us on Zoom and you want to ask a question, you can use the chat box in Zoom. Again, if you're on a PC or laptop, it's down at the bottom of the window. If you're on a mobile device, you may need to tap the screen once to see the chat box appear. Otherwise, if you're on Facebook Live, just leave your question in the comment section. So for those of you on Zoom, if you would like to come on camera and on mic, you can just write that in the chat box that you have a question, and we'll queue you up and we'll unmute you and get your video going. If you're a bit camera shy, you can just type your question in the chat box, and Heather and myself will relay that question to Justin on your behalf. Similarly, for our Facebook Live viewers, just type your question out and I'll relay it to Justin. So without further ado, Heather, I'm sure you have a question or two.
I do. I'm interested, Justin, in the Irish history. My own family has the Irish connection. So, and I'm wondering, when you're looking at the history of Myland, do you see waves of immigration changing and in certain time frames? The Irish, were they here in the 1840s, for example, and then came in later? I'm not sure. If you see a pattern in waves of people coming in and then leaving. I think you alluded to it, but I just was interested in what you've discovered about that.
Okay, yes, I could certainly be more explicit about that. So the Irish in Montreal as a whole, of course, had arrived already by the 1820s, and there was the huge wave of the 1840s. During those periods, Myland was completely undeveloped. All there were stone quarries and a small village for quarry workers, and they were essentially French Canadian. In fact, I would say probably entirely. It's really when Myland is developed as a suburban, and it's a true suburb. It's Montreal. It's outside the city limits, and it's completely new greenfield development. But the suburbs of the 1890s are not bungalows on twisty streets. They are row houses on streets that are not too far away from a brand new electric streetcar service. And that new suburb, there were many of them around Montreal. Mile-End was certainly not unique, but it was one of the suburbs that was well marketed and that got, was well situated. It got interest from all the communities. So whether people were Anglo-Protestant, Francophone Catholic, or Anglophone Catholic, they tended to be interested in moving to this new suburb as long as they had the means to do so. And as it turns out, of course, although the neighborhood was initially targeted towards more wealthy, more Anglo-Protestant people, they didn't come in sufficient numbers to take up all the building lots. And then the industrial development brought in many people of less substantial means to build slightly less fancy, but still very nice housing. And so it's really in the 1890s and the 1900s that you end up with this little wave of Irish migration. And St. Michael's Parish is founded in 1902, I believe. And then it moved to this fabulous new building in 1915. So you can tell then that in that period, there's this big wave of Irish immigration to migration towards Mile-End. And the community, although the Anglophone Protestants mostly disappear around the end of the First World War, the Irish community seems to be quite vigorous in the interwar period. But at the end of the Second World War, you see a great emptying out of the Jewish and the Irish and the remaining Anglo-Protestant, and to some extent as well the French-Canadian community. I mean, people who have the money to move elsewhere do so in the 1940s and 50s. And again, it's pretty universal for Montreal old neighborhoods, and not just Montreal. It's like that all across Canada, all across North America. There's, the big thing is that you have to live in a new suburb where you can drive your car. And so that's right. The ending of, it turns out that the Irish presence in Mile-End is not really specifically Irish. It's like, as the neighborhood becomes popular, people, the Irish are part of the Montreal mosaic. And as all of Montreal moves to these new neighborhoods, they come in. And as all of Montreal decides to abandon these neighborhoods, they move out.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, thank you. I think we have a question from Jody.
Jody, I'm going to unmute you there. You can start your video if you like. I'll leave that up to you. Hey, Jody, you're on.
Hi, hello. There we go. Okay. Thanks, Glenn. And thank you, Justin, so much for the really interesting presentation. I know very little about Montreal history in any depth, and know enough to be able to connect to some of what you were talking about today. So it was fascinating, and especially the architecture of that church does stand out as unique. So that was interesting as well. At the very end of your presentation, you alluded to kind of the future of Mile-End. I know this is, we're looking, it's always hard to predict where it might be going, but I guess what do you see, or what are the changes that are going on now in terms of the population there, and where do you think it's headed for the future? Which again, we can't always predict the future. There are unknown things, but I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Well, okay. As the neighborhood has become more popular, the neighborhood has been basically on the upswing since the early 80s. It's a gradual thing. You could say that it hit rock bottom around 1980 to 82. There were newspaper articles, even in the Globe and Mail in Toronto, but the Montreal papers were constantly reporting about arson fires that were devastating the area. It wasn't just Mile-End. I mean, Montreal's central neighborhoods were in bad shape at that point, and it was too easy to set fires, and it was too hard to rent apartments, and so everything sort of spontaneously caught fire as a symptom of a very, very weak rental market and a neighborhood that was very run down and sort of abandoned. But then as it became more interesting, and as those yuppies, those urban pioneers came in the early 80s and started renovating houses, and they had the leverage to lobby City Hall for better municipal services, for better attention towards things going on that shouldn't be going on, making fire control, all sorts of things, so that the quality of life gradually improved over a period of the next couple of decades. I should also mention it wasn't just people, with some wealth. It was also, there's a lot of community organization, and again, in many neighborhoods of Montreal, things like the Comité Logement Saint-Louis, which became the Comité Logement du Plateau, all sorts of social assistance organizations in many different milieux. All these organizations came together to really push towards improving the quality of life in central neighborhoods, including Mile End. And then the Mile End Citizens Committee, with its activities to bring different communities together and to celebrate the neighborhood, created this, sort of this fame for the area, where the Saint Jean Baptiste Day celebrations were so celebrated that, after 10 years or so, they were becoming huge, because people were migrating that day from all over the city to see what was going on in Mile End and to participate in the very fun street parties. And the musicians were giving concerts in all these little hole-in-the-wall venues. And so that is the thing that is in our collective memory of Mile End's cool period, and Mile End's as a place where it was affordable and fun to be. And that started disappearing already around 2000, because the housing market tightened up by then. There were enough people were now living, all the apartments were full. You couldn't find an empty apartment just by wandering around. You had to try hard for it. And it didn't get better. When the old clothing manufacturing district, which had collapsed during the 1990s as clothing manufacturing moved overseas, and Mile End was important for clothing manufacturing, had a lot of buildings that were dedicated to clothing manufacturing, became largely empty. Lots of artists moved into those empty production spaces for a few years, and then they became interesting for offices, and especially Ubisoft's expansion, and other companies came in as well. So we have a really thriving, busy employment sector now, with many companies in software, in video games, in film production, but even things like a back office of Sun Life, and all sorts of things. There's like restaurants have their collective kitchens, and it's a little bit of everything, but there's a lot of activity going on there. A lot of demand for housing for people who want to live near where they work. A lot of pressure on housing prices, exacerbated by tourism, especially in the past 10 years or so, leading to far too many Airbnbs being set up in the area. The city has cracked down on the Airbnbs. The pandemic has calmed the tourism down. So we'll see how that works out. As for the general popularity of the neighborhood and the desire to have, to be able to live in this area, which is so well situated, close to central Montreal, close to all the jobs in the former clothing factory district, that's much harder to deal with, because as long as it stays popular, the prices will stay up. The city does try to help out by promoting housing co-op projects, by providing some public housing, by trying to maintain some artist workshops, by cutting deals with developers. You maintain the artist workshops and we'll let you do something you want to do. But it's hard. It's hard because in a situation of lots of popularity for the space, how do you arbitrate the demand? And in our market-based system, it's generally the person who pays more who gets to have the space. And that's why we end up seeing prices going up. So I think the best hope for keeping things from going into monocultural rich neighborhood is, especially, as so many other Montreal central neighborhoods have also become really desirable. And as hopefully Montreal is adding new housing at a rate to match the population growth, so that instead of having, Mile End might have been the first neighborhood or among the first neighborhoods to be completely rehabilitated from its industrial past, but the whole city is doing that. And so I'm sort of hopeful that the pressure on my land is not going to keep on building, and that things will eventually work themselves out, hopefully to reflect the general mix of Montreal society as it's bound to stay a much wealthier neighborhood than it's been at times in the past. But I have hope for that the Montreal mix will prevail, and that we'll end up having a neighborhood that remains interesting and that remains diverse despite the difficulty of finding a place to live these days. So sorry, that's a very, very long answer, but it's almost as if I'm tacking on to my talk.
No, it's
one
great,
could give
Justin.
another talk on a subject like that.
For sure. Jody got the full story. It's fabulous. We all did. Thank you. I see that one of our loyal viewers, Deb Renault, has just a comment for you. She said, my Spalding ancestors lived in Mile End in 1850. The brothers were, 5 brothers were jewelers, Spalding Brothers Jewelers on St. Lawrence Boulevard. A few years later, Burke's purchased it. So that's kind of interesting. Someone has a deep history into the community.
Yeah, that's interesting. Spalding is a name that I know from mid-19th century landowners, and I didn't realize that they were jewelers. And so I'm sure, and there's so many stories to follow up and research, but I'll take a look into that and maybe come up with some interesting connections. There was a whole loyalist, United Empire loyalist strand in Mile End at the beginning of the 19th century, and I can't remember now whether the Spaldings came out of that or if they were another Anglophone family. In any case, the Mile End had, I mentioned John Clark and the bags, and so there were Anglophones in the area from the beginning of the 19th century. There were also Smiths and Kips and other names that were associated directly with loyalist families who had come through Nova Scotia into Quebec and settled around the Montreal area, including parts of Mile End. But yeah, the Spaldings are one of those names from the 19th century that we'll just need to go and do more research into them. Anyway, thank you for pointing that out.
Bev, if you know anything and you want to leave any other information in the chat, we sure appreciate it. I'm going to just go over to Facebook. I did see a question over there. Daniel asks, I hope this isn't too left field, but can you explain if and when the area between Saint Laurent and Saint Denis switched from Mile End to the Plateau? Is that a later naming?
Okay, Mile End and Plateau, first of all, Plateau Montréal is a name that does not appear before the 1930s. And when it first shows up, it shows up as the description for the area along Mount Royal Avenue, east of Saint Denis Street, but also for La Fontaine Park area. And it may just be confusion, but as it turns out, there was the Plateau area where Place des Arts is, closer downtown. There was a school there called the École de Plateau, and it moved into La Fontaine Park, thereby creating a Plateau institution in the park. But essentially, it was the Merchants Association on Mount Royal Avenue in the late 1930s that decided to call their area Plateau Montréal, and that's what really started that name there. So the idea of Plateau Montréal has spread out from Mount Royal Avenue. Michel Tremblay, of course, with his Chronique du Plateau Montréal, his novel series from the late 70s, early 80s, made that name very popular and very appreciated. But until the late 80s, when the boroughs were first created, Plateau Montréal was definitely seen as a more easterly phenomenon. And Mile End, once the name was revived in the 80s, it was generally considered to go from the edge of Outremont on the west side to about Saint Denis Street, maybe not even Saint Denis Street, and then from Mount Royal Avenue up to the railway tracks, even though historically the area beyond the railway tracks had also been part of Mile End. It's all very, very fuzzy over time. when the boroughs were first created by Jean Doré's administration in the 1980s, and they weren't yet self-governing the way they are today, but there was a Plateau Mont-Royal Centre Sud borough that included all of the current Plateau Mont-Royal borough plus a bit south of Sherbrooke Street as well. The thing to take into account about borough names is that their names are a summary and they include many neighborhoods. So, for example, the borough of Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, that doesn't mean the whole thing is Rosemont. It just means that it's a borough that goes from Rosemont in the east to Petite-Patrie in the west, passing through possibly other areas. Well, actually, that's a good example where you could consider that perhaps all of the territory is either Rosemont or Petite-Patrie. In any case, the case of the borough of Plateau Mont-Royal, it covers areas that at different times have historically had names that are distinct from Plateau, and yet since the 80s, and especially since the boroughs were revived and given their own councils in 2002, Mile-End is officially part of the borough of Plateau Mont-Royal and one of the districts of its council since 2002. Now, what people consider to be the end of Mile-End, the edge of Mile-End, is in many ways very personal. In many ways, it depends what time they're talking about it. And now, just to confuse things further, the municipal electoral district of Mile-End has changed its boundaries many, many times since it was created in the 1980s. And it generally expands because the tendency in Montreal has been since the 80s has been to have fewer and larger electoral districts over time. So Mile-End has been lucky not to get eliminated, but as other districts have been eliminated and the areas have been growing, the Mile-End district has become larger and larger. And these days, the electoral district goes all the way out to La Fontaine Park. What am I saying? All the way out to Laurier Park and Christophe Colomb Street, which is sort of stretching things historically. And yet, on the other hand, if you go back to the mid-19th century, Mile-End was used pretty much as a synonym for the whole area with the quarries, the whole village of Côte Saint-Louis as incorporated in 1846. The official name of the place was Côte Saint-Louis, but the post office for the whole thing was called Mile-End. So you could say that historically Mile-End and the Plateau, are the same area, and they specialize to different zones in this area, and they overlap. And sometimes one is subordinate to the other. Sometimes they're synonyms. Sometimes one exists and the other doesn't exist. And a lot of the time, it's up to what people think in their heads anyway, because these names don't necessarily have, it's not like national boundaries where people are defining something very, very clearly and carefully. They are boundaries that are perceived by the population who lives there, and the perceptions change over time as well.
That's really interesting. You said that. I know some people involved in oral history and such have made this practice of interviewing older residents, younger residents about their perception of what their neighborhood is, where it starts and where it stops, and having them draw a map and seeing what comes out. And it definitely is. It can be a fairly nebulous thing. I think any neighborhood, urban neighborhoods are no exception, even though they are often bounded by streets. I had a fairly specific question. Thinking of my own recent Mile-End memories, obviously the Champ des Possibles is I'd say a very important site, and I'd say the cultural life it has a symbolic value too, it seems to me, in the last 15, 20 years at least. And I noticed you talked about this, the train station, the Mile-End. Would that be located roughly where today's Champ des Possibles is?
They're very, 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 very close. The railway station was located actually right at the top of Saint-Dominique Street, where it hits Bernard. And if you can think of the area in great detail, you may remember that there's this warehouse that had a big sign outside it that said Textile Central Américain. And then a few years ago, the walls, there was a small fire, and then the walls and the roof were taken off, but the steel structure is still there. That was built immediately adjacent on the east side of the station in the in 1959, 1960. And so if you go to that now skeleton of a warehouse and you stand on its west side, you are basically where the railway station was. More particularly, there's a fence, and there's an area there that's fenced off. Part of it is under the Rosemont Van Horn Viaduct. And the reason that area is fenced off is because it was rented until only a couple of years ago by the neighboring flooring store, Million Tapis et Tuiles. And Million Tapis et Tuiles had been renting that space since the 1960s. And in the 60s, there was still a building there, and that building was the old Mile End Railway Station. So they were the last tenants of the old railway station. Then the station was demolished, and they continued being tenants of its land, its piece of the territory on the ground. And that station piece, that station space, is then right beside the warehouse, which is contiguous with the Champ des Possibles. And so all of it has been since 2009 owned by the city of Montreal. So it's, and of course, it's all part of the old Mile End railway site of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The Canadian Pacific was the company that bought the Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, and Occidental back in 1882, and thus they've owned it ever since. Yeah, it's related. Although when we think of the Champ des Possibles, we think mostly of the bigger open area, which is a little bit farther east, but it's contiguous and part of the railway property that starts at the station and heads out there. Canadian Pacific basically, apart from the railway station, then they set up initially a freight office to be able to receive merchandise and deliver merchandise. And then as the area industrialized, they built local service tracks. This was done everywhere until the 1960s. If you had a factory, the railway company would build a track to your door to make it easy to do sending and receiving. And when they had so many industries all clustered together, the railway company needed to have a place to store the freight cars in between deliveries. And so they built essentially railway parking lots, little rail yards. And the Champ des Possibles is the last remaining unbuilt quarter of what had been the Saint Louis rail yard. And the Saint Louis rail yard was located right next to the Mile End railway station property. So it was all, that's how they ended up being all connected together.
Is the status of the Champ des Possibles? I know there was, and I hadn't followed the file that closely, but is its fate or its existence as we know today, is it fairly secure for the time being?
I would say so, yes. The borough of Plateau Montréal is responsible for the space. But since 2009, I suppose, or 2010 anyway, since quite early, I'm not sure the exact starting date, but around that time, it's been more than 10 years now, they've had this co-management agreement with a community group called the Amis des Champs Les Amis du Champ des Possibles. And Les Amis du Champ des Possibles still have their agreement with the borough, and the borough has not shown any signs of wanting to do anything different with it. I think there's a lot of community support for the maintenance of the space the way it is. There are occasional difficulties. It's an open space that is not really supervised, and sometimes behavior can get a little out of hand, but I don't think those problems have been sufficiently severe or consistent to really cause a crisis. And so things are dealt with, and it's also, very well used for all sorts of activities, all sorts of age groups, all sorts of social groups. It's really a very diverse playground for people. The only, there's the other problem with the site is that it's contaminated land in the sense that it was used for a long time for storing rail cars that dripped various chemicals. There are spots here and there which are considered to be more contaminated than others. And one of the important things that Les Amis du Champ des Possibles set up from the very beginning was they wanted to encourage the Quebec Ministry of the Environment not to force a standard decontamination where you take all the soil away and bring in new soil. They said this has been sitting here now unused for 25 years, even 30 years by the time the site became city property. And nature has already done a great deal of mitigation work for the contamination. And in these past 30 years of mostly undisturbed usage, or sorry, most of sitting there fallow, mostly undisturbed, huge numbers of organisms of all sorts have come into the area. So it's a site of remarkable biodiversity. And as a result, a conventional decontamination would do more harm than good. So we'll keep an eye on it. We'll make sure that people don't have, don't dig holes and have picnics in the bottom of the hole, because the soil is not necessarily clean in that way. But as long as people are not digging in the dirt, the chemical contamination is on its way to disappearing, and they've done different projects to try and encourage that or mitigate it as well. So it's a very interesting site for all sorts of reasons, for social engineering, or for seeing what you can do with a public space without making it into a formal park, and also for environmental mitigation, and also for just allowing the seeds and the insects and the birds and the small creatures to make it their space, and as well as the humans.
Exactly. It's a special place. For those who don't know, it's kind of like, I guess you could call it almost like a small urban meadow of sorts. It's surprising. I think, like you say, it might be fairly recent, but the biodiversity and it's almost like you're in some parts of it, it's like you're out of the city. And it's not a large space either. I think it's about a few, maybe, how you'd quantify it, but it's really just along a section of the railroad track and behind the old industrial buildings, I guess, on De Gaspé.
Yeah,
or is it
runs
Casgrain?
between De Gaspé. No, it runs between De Gaspé and Henri Julien for the most part. Although there's what you could call the Panhandle, which is right along the railway tracks, running a block west to Casgrain, and then that's where the warehouse skeleton starts, and then another block west to Saint-Dominique, and you get to where the old railway station used to be. I'd like to add one more small point, which was that I keep on talking about the Irish presence in Mile-End as a Catholic presence, but one mustn't forget that the Irish community in Montreal has never been exclusively Catholic, and there definitely were Protestant people of Irish origin in Mile-End as well. One family who even sent us some pictures showing how they were parishioners of the Church of the Ascension, the church that became the Anglican church that became the public library. More than anything else, and Mile-End has just been over the decades, over the centuries, has been a reflection of the Montreal cultural mosaic in many, many ways. And I think obviously less so today because it's more unaffordable, but for the 20th century, it was really a nice picture of all aspects of Montreal society, pretty much.
Justin, that's been really fascinating. I don't know if there's any more questions on Facebook, Glenn, but
there's no more on Facebook. No, I did just check. I'll check quickly, but I think looks like we're good.
Okay. Well, this has been a presentation I've been looking forward to for a long time, because I knew that you were the guy that knew all about Mile-End. You're the historian that people rely on for the accuracy and for information that's so diverse and widespread, as obvious today. You're able to speak from right from the beginning to urban meadows. So a really wonderful talk. And thank you so much for being with us, Justin. I really appreciate the information that you've given to us. And I realize, not being a Montrealer, that I actually have been to Mile-End without really knowing I've been in that neighborhood. And I've seen the beautiful St. Michael's Church and eaten at Walensky's, and just have wandered through the streets and didn't realize that I was in such a marvelous neighborhood in Montreal. And you've given me a new appreciation for it. And I absolutely would like to take one of the walking tours. And that's just one of my final questions. You've given us such great information about Mile-End Memories, the organization itself. And is it possible just to go to your website to find out when you're doing public lectures and walking tours and sign up for that sort of thing?
Yes, the website's mile-end.qc.ca. We try to keep it up to date. There's the calendar page, which is, at least it's currently mentioning Jane's Walks next weekend. And we will get our calendar, we'll get our summer tour schedule up there as soon as we figure out what it's going to be. Also, we have Yves Desjardins takes care of the Facebook page, and he does a better job than I do at getting information up quickly. So it's worthwhile checking out Facebook for My Land Memories. We have both a page and a group, and the discussion in the group can be quite interesting too.
Okay.
So yes, watch. Also, we do send out newsletters by email, and on the website there's a little email envelope icon on every page that you can click on to join the mailing list. So check the website, check Facebook, or sign up for a mailing list, and we'll be happy to let you know what's going on.
Okay, thank you so much. That'll be great, and we can add that information in our post too, so that people can find you. So thank you very much again for joining us today, Justin. It was really a wonderful presentation. Thank you to all of you who joined us as well. As I said before, this is our last presentation in our Heritage Talk series for 2022. It's been wonderful, and if you've missed any of our presentations, please go to our Facebook page, Quan Heritage Talks, where you'll find this presentation recorded, as well as all of our other ones as well. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my colleague, my friend Glenn Patterson, who's been crucial in keeping the series all connected and running smoothly. It's not an easy feat when we have so many rural connections, from Ujia-Bougamou to the Gaspé, West Quebec, the townshippers as well. So thank you, Glenn. It's been great and well done. A thank you to our wonderful funders again, and to our viewers who have been so supportive. Some of you have been to every single one of our presentations, so a shout out to you as well. Thank you to our Executive Director, Matthew Farfan, our President, Grant Myers, and to our board members who've all been so supportive as well. Please watch for the return of Heritage Talks Online in our new series with a new team, actually, and a new theme. Glenn and I are heading off to do other projects with Quan. And if you're interested in becoming a member of Quan, please go to our website at qahn.org for more information and become a part of our really great dynamic network of people. You can see people like Justin Burr, who's writing and researching, and others who look into the diverse, wonderful cultural communities that make up Quebec right across the province. So thank you again, everyone. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Bye for now. Have a good afternoon.